1953 was the first Bond novel, Casino Royale. And it's very much a post-war novel. So all the things we associate Bond with now, all the luxury goods and the cocktails and food that he eats, those were luxuries in the 1950s. So Bond kind of bursts on the scene after the war with all these exciting, luxurious goods. And he also provides a kind of tourist route through Britain and through the world after the war.
And Monica, how did James Bond, do you think, come about? He seems very much a creation of Ian Fleming's time.
Absolutely. As Penny was saying, he is the product of a very distinctive post-war climate. The 1950s, we tend to think of as a decade of gender conservatism, where women who had got a degree of emancipation during the 1940s and then in many ways replaced men in factories and any kind of positions that men previously occupied, had to go back to their homes and become again wives and homemakers. Nevertheless, I think the 1950s is a much more complicated era, whereby masculinity is in a state of crisis. Veterans come back home from the front, often wounded both psychologically and physically. And Bond is precisely that man. He is wounded from the start. If you read Casino Royale or view the 2006 film adaptation, you'll know that the character's debut is marked by a very dramatic ordeal. So he represents a kind of masculinity which on the outside represents outward confidence, hypermasculinity, you could say, strength, virility, but under his clothes, so to speak, is a very scarred body.
And Penny, he's not fantastically realistic, is he? But does that really matter? Or isn't it all really a question of spinning a good yarn?
Well, that certainly became the case in the films, particularly with the Roger Moore films. Kind of strangely, Fleming thought that Bond was quite realistic. He thinks that the background that he provides Bond with is quite real. He uses the term verisimilitude, the idea of realism in fiction. And I think that's partly shown in the extraordinary detail that Fleming gives us in the novels about the cars, the cocktails. We learn in Casino Royale that the martini Bond drinks is not at all what we come to expect from the films. And the 1950s were also a decade of literary realism, so-called Angry Young Men. A very famous novel then in the 1950s was John Brayne's Room at the Top, which is about a young working class lad who aspires to the wealth and the success that the post-war decade was offering. He has an Aston Martin, or he rather admires someone else who has an Aston Martin. Bond in the early novels has a Bentley, actually 1930s Bentley. So although the legend of Bond has become extremely exaggerated, kind of hyper-masculine, comedic, particularly with the Moore films, perhaps less so with more recent Daniel Craig films. That's not quite what Fleming wanted. He thought that these novels were more real, perhaps, than looking back, we expect them to be.
Yeah. Monica, you've written a book about Bond girls in the age of Me Too. Is that a problem?
Well, not for me, obviously.
It's not for me either, but for some it could be.
The term Bond girl has been the object of some kind of controversy. I don't think the word girl in itself is problematic. It is problematic only if you interpret it in a kind of sexist way. But there are many other ways in which the girl word can be used. For example, you know, you can talk about girls' night out or girls' power. And in both of those instances, the term girl signifies playfulness and a way of inhabiting and performing gender that is not strictly abiding to the rules of patriarchy. And I see that Bond girls do exactly that. And besides the fact that they can be young women, especially in the books, but girlhood is more of a state of mind, I would say, more in tune with the notion of youthquake that really was ushered in the 1960s, where the cinematic Bond also started. So it really reflects an idea of independence, resilience, and a really more gender fluid way of thinking about womanhood, I would say.
Is it really sort of unusual to have Bond girls, Bond spies? Because the two names I could think of female spies were Mata Hari and the sort of cartoonish Modesty Blaze. It's not really been a place traditionally for women spying. It's the sort of secretive man, the glamorous world of spying as created and apologised for by John le Carré.
Well, historically, there were actually many women, many female agents who worked in the Second World War, and some of whom Fleming certainly had at the back of his mind when he was writing the character, for example, of Vesper Lind. So I don't think it's strictly true that historically there haven't been any female agents. And certainly what Fleming brings about is a range of female characters who are not just eye candy, although beautiful they certainly are. They have their own missions, and often they are either helpful to Bond as sidekicks in action, or they can be villains. And as villains, they will be, you know, placing hurdles and obstacles. And we see that in many of the most memorable female characters in the films, from say Fiona Volpe in Thunderball to Xenia Onatopp in GoldenEye. Both of those characters do somehow give Bond a very hard time while enjoying the pleasures that he may afford them.
On that theme, Monica, Jane Bond, the name's Bond, Jane Bond. Is that going to happen?
Well, interestingly, in the next installment of the franchise, whenever that's going to be released, we are going to have a female 007, not a female Bond as such, but a female 007 played by Lashana Lynch. And I think it is very interesting to have more interesting female roles who have, you know, an important part in the mission alongside James Bond. Nevertheless, I think James Bond as a character, I think, should remain James Bond. He is a character in his own right. And even if he has flaws, he may be sexist, he is patronizing. In the past, he was certainly racist. But we can still deal with that if we have characters on screen who play strong roles, who question and challenge those aspects of his character.
And Penny, what about spy fiction in general? How healthy is that in 2020? Is there still room for spy fiction?
Oh, very much so. In fact, spy fiction is kind of having a renaissance at the moment, partly with female spy novelists like Lauren Wilkinson, Ali Munro, August Thomas, and most famously Stella Rimington, you know, who was head of MI5 and now has a career as a spy novelist. The spy novel is being reinvented, particularly with the novels of Mick Herron, who has created, you know, a kind of alternative world of spies who've been pushed out of the glamorous world of, you know, James Bond type secrecy and hang out in an
It's very real, the world of the Mick Herron spy, isn't it? It's very grubby.
Yeah, Slough House. And the spies who are banished there are called the slow horses. But because they are so idiosyncratic and distinctive, they're allowed to break the rules, or they do break the rules. tactics, and they get things done that other spies perhaps can't.
So even though the Cold War's over, you both think there is room for spy fiction for the future?
Definitely. The spy novel isn't a product of the Cold War. It really starts in the 1890s with kind of invasion narratives. Everyone is terrified the Germans are going to invade. And then you have novels like John Buchan's spy series. So it's not dependent on the Cold War. In fact, it's not really dependent on any wars. And I'm absolutely certain that it will continue to develop and evolve.
Yes, I mean, I would say the way James Bond has evolved as well as a character, you know, in the literary novels to begin with, the conflict is mainly between, you know, the West and the Soviet bloc. But then it evolves even in Fleming, the enemy evolves into a more global organization in the form of Spectre, which is what we see in the films. So it really is about global geopolitics. And so in that respect, it will always be relevant. There will always be some kind of conflict, sadly, in the world. But as Penny says, it's not necessarily to do with conflict, but more to do with the very interesting and thrilling world that is international espionage and international politics.